Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 20 cable stations from Vermont to New York City and 24/7 on the internet at thestruggle.org. And welcome to viewers in Boston, Massachusetts at our new Monday evening time slot. Stocks may be off their March lows, but unemployment and state budget cuts are getting worse. What effect is this having on the American family, on women, and on men's sense of worth? Harriet, Fraad, psychotherapist, talked all about this in April in West Haven, Connecticut, and we're going to devote our program today to her thoughts on the subject. It's not a pretty picture. The safety net has been shredded, and the family and local community are not able to give the kind of support they once did to people having hard times. The result has been outbursts of crazy violence. The end of the American dream started some 40 years ago when the CEOs got the upper hand and wages became stagnant.
In 1970, real wages froze for the first time in 150 years. The idea that every generation could do better than the last was statistically true between 1820 and 1970 because wages went up at the same point as profits, so that they were two parallel lines like a railroad track. Then in 1970, probably because of the influx of immigrants and because of computer technology, they didn't have to raise the wages anymore. They continued to profit, wages stayed flat, which created a problem, right? And what happened was that the steadily increasing wage, which increased for those 150 years, meant that every majority, all white men, got a family wage. They got one supplement for being white and another supplement for being male, because women doing the same work would not have gotten as high a wage, and neither would minorities. And so that, they had those two bonuses previous to 1970. After 1970, profits increased, wages flattened, and so the enormous increase was at the top at the expense of the middle and the bottom. In 1970, the United States was the most egalitarian nation in the Western world. Now it is the least egalitarian nation in the Western world because profits accrued to the top and wages froze. So
why was that?
What happened is that in 1970, they no longer had to raise wages. So they had computers, they had immigrants, so that profits kept rising, but wages froze. And I'm talking about real wages, what you can actually buy with your dime. And so that there began the enormous gap that now exists that makes us the most unequal nation in the Western world. And so that families were hurting. The male wage that the majority of families got at that time, because the United States is also, the demography is changing. By 2042, there will be more minority or more non-white Americans than there are white Americans. But that's a recent demographic shift. Families were really hurting because there was no longer enough money to live on. Prices kept going up, wages froze. There's a huge discrepancy in between. And so that families were experiencing economic desperation. And one of the first adjustments was to send women into the workforce full-time. It used to be before that if times were hard, if someone was sick, if a man were laid off, women were a reserve army of unemployed people who could come in and help out and then leave. That changed. In 1970, 40% of American women were in the labor force, mostly part-time. By 2000, 77% of women were in the labor force, mostly full-time. As a dramatic figure, 60% of women with children under 1 are now in the labor force, mostly full-time. So what happens is women are pushed into full-time labor with ever more scarce assistance with daycare, childcare, health care, after-school programs, safe neighborhoods where kids could be. And in spite of that, women's work outside of the home could help, but it really couldn't make up for the amount that was lost, because women's work has its own costs, not only the obvious ones, work clothes and transportation, but the much greater cost, which is the cost of purchasing all those goods and services that women used to produce for nothing. So, for example, if you make your own bread, who cared? Now, if you buy it, it's about $4 a loaf for homemade fresh bread. So, all of the things, cooked meals, compare takeout to prepare at home, mended, cleaned clothes, your own laundry that you do at home versus having your laundry dry cleaned or taking it to a laundromat. The latest figures are that if a stay-at-home mother were replaced by all paid services, everything a woman does, shopping, cooking, cleaning, childcare, emotional work of making people happy, it would cost $116,805 a year. And the domestic services that are provided by a mom who already works full-time would be $68,406 a year. So you're talking about families are still financially hurting because they're pushed into buying what women used to produce for nothing. It wasn't valued very much because women did it. It was women's work, which was less valuable. But now families have to purchase these services because women were unable to perform as many services after a hard day's work, both emotional services and also cooking services, cleaning services, daycare, after-school care, entertaining, all those things. So what happened? The people at the top who are getting this incredible share, because, you know, this is the line of wages that you're getting, real wages, this is the line of profits, all this in between is being accumulated on the top. Families still can't live. So the corporate sector had the brilliant idea of loaning to people whose wages you never rose the money on which to live and charging them 17 to 25% for those loans, i.e. the credit card was born. So by the time Bush took over, there was this crisis, this volatile combination of reduced salaries and wildly accelerated credit card debt that people couldn't pay back with their frozen salaries. And within that disaster, Bush further weakened any regulation that could have inhibited the additional growth at the top at the expense of the majority, the middle, and the bottom. Banks all over America were less regulated, and the banks cooperated with the less regulated financial markets. They sold mortgages to millions of people they knew couldn't afford them because they could bundle them, combine them, and make bonds out of them and sell them at a high price. So they just wanted to turn over the real estate. And they sold people an amount of debt they couldn't possibly meet. This sales boom also helped inflate housing prices way beyond their reasonable value. And in addition, Bush initiated a $1 trillion tax cut and a $1 trillion war in Iraq and Afghanistan using up the Treasury. So that in addition, he hobbled many of the social programs that allowed people to survive.